Hi friends, I'm going to show you how to make this quilt vest using all upcycled materials and no fancy tools. I found the quilt that I'm using today from the Goodwill outlet store, but I also recommend checking out Facebook Marketplace or eBay if you need to find one. In the first part of this video, I'll show you how to self-draft a pattern for your vest using a garment that you already own. But if you're a member of my Patreon, I also have a printable pattern available, and that's included with the membership, so go check that out. If you already have the vest pattern, you can skip the self-drafting steps and use the timestamps in the description. Okay, now let's talk about the supplies you're going to need for this project. So first, obviously, is a quilt or 2 pillow shams. And the next thing you need is some cotton fabric to make bias tape with. I used old bed sheets for this. I find that works really well. I've also used a duvet cover before. We only need maybe a yard of fabric to make the bias tape for this project, but it should be in a color that you're comfortable being visible on the outside of your vest, so it should coordinate with the quilt that you picked out. And the last few things are no surprise. You need a sewing machine, you need some all-purpose thread, a heavy-duty needle to be able to go through the thickness of the quilt that you're working with, and fabric scissors, pins, or clips, and then a washable marker or tailor's chalk should work great. So starting with the self-drafting, find a t-shirt, button-down, or tank top in your closet that has the fit you want for your vest, and I recommend choosing something that fits you more on the looser side. Tracing the front vest pieces first, we're going to fold the front of the shirt in half lengthwise right down the center front. Make sure your shoulder seams on the shirt are aligned as well as the side seams. To get the back part of the shirt out of the way while I'm tracing the front part, I kind of fold it over at the side seam, and then as I'm tracing, I move the garment around to see where the seams are that I'm tracing, if that makes sense. I'm also rolling up the bottom edge of my shirt because I wanted my vest to be a little bit more cropped than this shirt is. Now simply trace around the edge, adding roughly a 1/2 inch seam allowance as you go. Once you've traced all the way around, cut out your first front vest piece. Now we're going to cut the other vest front piece, and for my vest I wanted the 2 front pieces to be perfect mirror images of each other, so I carefully matched the flowers up before I began tracing out the front piece. Now that you have 2 front vest pieces, it's time to follow the same steps for the back bodice piece. And I'm measuring the side seam length of my front bodice piece to make sure that I keep the same side seam length for the back bodice side seam. So once you've verified that those are the same length, you can just trace and cut it out like you did for the front. After I've cut out the back bodice piece, I am folding the back bodice in half lengthwise to make sure that each side is a mirror image of the other, and I'll just trim off any excess on each side. Lastly, I'm going to make sure that the shoulder seams on the front and back bodice pieces are also the same length, trimming those as needed. And once you've cut everything out, I recommend trying it on your body or on a mannequin to make sure you like the fit. We're going to start by preparing some bias tape for the project. I used 2-inch double folded bias tape for the armholes, neckline, and the ties, but for all the seams inside the vest, I used single fold 1.5-inch bias tape. You can use whatever size you prefer for all the seams. If you don't know how to make bias tape, I made a quick little video tutorial and it's linked below. Starting the construction on the vest, lay your front vest pieces on top of your back vest piece with right sides together, lining up those shoulder seams neatly. Sew the shoulder seams with about a 1/2-inch seam allowance, and as a reminder, make sure you have a needle in your machine that's big enough to be able to sew through your quilt. Once you've sewn those seams, cover them with bias tape. I opened up my single fold bias tape, lined up the raw edge with the seam, and then sewed it down. Then I sewed the other side of the bias tape down flat, and this method just gives you a nice, flat, strong seam. Once the shoulder seams are done, we're moving on to the armholes. This is where I used the 2-inch double fold bias tape. Starting on the wrong side of the garment, I measured how much bias tape I would need for the armhole, and then I recommend pinning it thoroughly before sewing if you're not familiar with using bias tape on curves. I often skip this pinning step because I'm a bit lazy. But sew in the first crease of your bias tape all the way along the armhole edge. Then you're going to turn your bias tape up and over the raw edge and top stitch on the other side. Again, pins are very helpful here. Do as I say, not as I do. And one other tip, make sure that as you're top stitching the bias tape, you are covering the original line of stitching from the other side. If you can't fully cover it, then just slightly trim your seam allowance. Okay, now that the armholes are finished, we're going to finish the side seams. Make sure your armhole edges are neatly lined up. Because that edge is already finished, there's no room to trim off any differences in the length, but we can trim from the bottom hem if needed. Once you've sewn the side seam, add bias tape, but leave a 1-inch tail at the top of the armpit seam. This is so that we can hide the top raw edge of the bias tape by folding that 1-inch tail over when we go to sew it down on the other side. So that's what I'm doing here. I'm flipping over that tail of the bias tape, and then I'm folding it over the seam before I sew it down flat. Now that the side seams are done, we're moving on to the front ties. I made two 16-inch ties using my bias tape. Then on the wrong side of the vest, we're going to pin the ties at your preferred placement with the finished edge pointing away from the neckline. And if you're using the pattern from Patreon, there's a notch on the pattern where you should pin your ties. Then you're just going to base stitch these in place, like roughly a 1/4 inch away from the edge. They'll get permanently sewn down when we add the bias tape all the way around the outer edge in the next step. Once your ties are basted, now it's time to sew the bias tape all the way around the neckline and the bottom hem. So measure how much bias tape you'll need and then pin it along the outer edge on the wrong side of the vest. Leave a tail that's a couple inches long at the start and at the end of your bias tape so that we can join the ends neatly later on. And I suggest starting to sew on a side seam. Sew slowly around those curves, making sure you don't have any bunching. And once again, pins would be very helpful here. So I got to the end of my bias tape and I realized that I cut it a couple inches too short. So I'm just going to add a few inches and then I'll finish sewing it on. So now that my two ends are meeting each other, I'm just going to trim the tails to be about 1 inch long. I'll mark where they need to join and then I'll just sew the two ends together. And then you can trim that seam allowance to be like roughly a 1/2 inch after that. Once the ends are joined, now it's time to flip the bias tape over the raw edge and top stitch it on the right side of the vest. Carefully pin where your ties are so that now they're pointing toward the neckline. Once you're ready to start sewing, take a look at the original stitching from the other side as you're top stitching this side of the bias tape. Make sure that it's covering the original stitching once again, and if it's not able to reach, just trim off a little bit of that seam allowance until the bias tape can cover it. And as you're going over the side seams, maybe just sew slowly. You might need to hand crank the needle through because it's going to be pretty thick. But this is your last step, so once you finish going all the way around, you'll have a completed vest, and you're ready to enjoy it for the rest of the cold months. Thank you for watching. I hope it was helpful, and I would love to see if you end up making your own vest. Thanks for upcycling and for wearing trash.